December 1942. The morning wind moved through the endless plains of Kansas, carrying with it the soft creak of an old wooden mill. Inside, a farmer named Harold Ames poured golden kernels into a grinding wheel that had belonged to his father. Outside, the fields lay pale under the frost, half harvested, half frozen, yet still stubbornly alive. The radio on the shelf crackled with news from North Africa and Guadalcanal. "Our boys are pushing forward," the announcer said, his voice steady but tired. Harold didn't look up. He only tightened his jaw, adjusted the chute, and watched as the crushed grain fell like fine yellow snow into a burlap sack. He wasn't thinking of Europe or the Pacific. He was thinking about waste. How much flour spoiled on long journeys. How much food never reached the men who needed it most. His solution was simple, almost laughably so. But before the war was over, that same humble mixture of corn and grit would feed millions of soldiers, saving time, fuel, and lives. That day in Kansas, the quiet turning of a millstone had already begun to change the outcome of a global war. When the United States entered the Second World War in December 1941, it faced a problem far more fundamental than tanks or planes: how to feed an army that never stopped moving. By 1942, more than 10 million men were preparing to fight across continents and oceans. Food had to travel farther, last longer, and stay edible through heat, humidity, and freezing cold. Logistics officers quickly realized that the battle for supply lines would decide the war long before any rifle was fired. Traditional rations were heavy and fragile. Wheat flour spoiled fast, bread molded during ocean crossings, and canned goods took up valuable cargo space. The Quartermaster Corps faced a relentless equation. Every extra pound of food meant one less bullet, one less gallon of fuel, one less chance of survival. Even before the first American convoy reached Europe, Washington knew the nation needed a new kind of efficiency, one rooted not in industry, but in agriculture. So the government turned inward, toward the heartland. The War Food Administration, created in 1943, began coordinating with local cooperatives and rural universities. Thousands of scientists, nutritionists, and farmers became part of what was quietly called the Food Front. Posters encouraged citizens to feed fighters with every acre. The message was clear. The plow was as powerful as the rifle. Midwestern farmers responded with ingenuity. They couldn't build tanks, but they could outthink nature. They noticed something obvious yet revolutionary. Corn was abundant, cheaper than wheat, and, when milled properly, lasted longer without spoilage. Unlike wheat flour, cornmeal could be stored in sealed containers without losing its nutritional value or attracting weevils during long sea voyages. Its higher density meant that ships could carry more calories per cubic foot. The realization sparked quiet experimentation in dozens of states. Agricultural stations in Iowa, Illinois, and Nebraska began testing mixtures of corn flour and wheat flour to create composite bread, a lighter but stable ration component. The U.S. Army Natick Laboratories would later formalize these experiments into standardized field rations, compact, calorically dense, and resistant to tropical humidity. But it began far earlier, in barns, kitchens, and mills run by ordinary people. By the summer of 1942, the impact was already measurable. Shipments of hybrid flour began replacing traditional cargo on convoys bound for the British Isles and North Africa. Quartermaster reports noted lower spoilage rates, sometimes by as much as 40%. Corn-derived binders were also introduced in gravies and soups, replacing expensive imports and reducing reliance on fragile refrigeration. Each small adjustment echoed across the logistics network. A single pound saved in flour weight could mean thousands of tons of extra ammunition transported over the course of a campaign. What began as a farmer's local solution became a cornerstone of Allied logistical superiority. Meanwhile, On the home front, rationing tightened. Housewives were encouraged to bake with Victory Mix, a blend of wheat and corn designed to conserve critical supplies for the troops. This cultural shift normalized corn as a patriotic ingredient. Recipes spread in newspapers. Corn biscuits for breakfast, cornbread for dinner, corn gravy for the boys overseas. A new taste of war was forming, the flavor of resourcefulness. The government didn't publicize these shifts widely. Secrecy protected supply innovations as much as code-breaking did. But within the food industry, the Corn Initiative was considered a quiet revolution. Industrial-scale mills expanded their capacity to process maize. Rail lines were redirected toward granaries, and chemical engineers refined corn derivatives for use in adhesives, medical supplies, and even explosives. Corn was no longer just a crop. It was strategy. The genius lay in its simplicity. Corn flour didn't win battles. It sustained the men who did. It made the impossible distances of the Pacific traversable, the endless marches of Europe survivable. And behind every ration tin stamped U.S. Army was the invisible work of farmers who never saw the front line, yet fought the war one sack at a time. The next step in this story takes us from the fields of Kansas to the laboratories and policy rooms of Washington, where the humble kernel would be transformed from a regional staple into a military instrument of global consequence. By early 1943, the United States had become not just the arsenal of democracy, but also its breadbasket. Every farm, mill, and research station was mobilized under the logic of total war. Tanks and ships could be mass-produced in factories, but sustaining millions of soldiers in every corner of the globe required an invisible supply chain stretching from the Great Plains to the front lines. Inside the War Food Administration, led by Secretary of Agriculture Claude Wickard, a quiet transformation was underway. Agricultural scientists from Purdue, Iowa State, and the University of Illinois were asked to study how to make corn as versatile as wheat, or even more so. The goal was not gourmet quality. It was endurance. Could corn be stored for months without molding? Could it replace half of the wheat in a soldier's daily ration without weakening the dough or reducing calories? Research labs became as vital as armories. The Department of Agriculture's Northern Regional Research Laboratory in Peoria, Illinois, began to analyze the chemistry of cornstarch and gluten interactions. Technicians tested mixtures in controlled humidity chambers, replicating the jungles of New Guinea and the deserts of North Africa. They found that a 60-40 corn-to-wheat blend, stabilized with a small amount of soy protein, could maintain structure and freshness even after weeks of transport. This finding seemed minor, but it rewrote the logistics manual of modern warfare. The Quartermaster Corps soon incorporated these findings into K rations and C rations, compact, pre-cooked meal systems issued to every soldier. Corn flour thickened the gravies, stabilized the soups, and lightened the biscuits. Its fine particles absorbed moisture efficiently, keeping food palatable and safe. By mid-1943, the scale of production was staggering. More than 500,000 tons of corn products were being converted annually for military use. Factories in the Midwest ran around the clock. Freight trains carried carloads of yellow grain eastward toward New York and New Jersey, where ships waited to cross the Atlantic. Every rail car symbolized calories, endurance, and the slow, mechanical heartbeat of Allied logistics. The British government even adopted similar formulations after studying American shipments, realizing that corn-based foodstuffs withstood the damp transatlantic voyages better than traditional bread. But there was another layer, one of psychology and morale. Corn was deeply American. It carried a taste of home. Soldiers from rural backgrounds recognized its flavor instantly in their rations, in biscuits, mush, and gravy. It reminded them of the Midwest, of their mothers' kitchens, of mornings before the war. A familiar flavor could steady a man more than an officer's command. In letters sent home, soldiers often mentioned that cornbread taste, as one of the few comforting constants amid chaos. Behind this logistical marvel stood policy innovation. Washington realized that food science could be weaponized as efficiently as radar or code breaking. The Office of Price Administration stabilized corn prices, preventing inflation and ensuring that farmers could profit without hoarding. Agricultural engineers redesigned silos and packaging, creating airtight storage methods with wax-lined bags and early plastics derived from corn byproducts. By 1944, the results spoke for themselves. Allied troops landing in Normandy carried lightweight rations, half of which contained corn derivatives. Each man's daily food weighed nearly a pound less than comparable Axis supplies, multiplied across divisions. That meant ships could carry thousands of extra tons of ammunition or medical cargo. The smallest kernel now represented an advantage measured in miles and survival. What had begun as a local experiment on American farms became a global model for wartime logistics. Corn was no longer just sustenance. It was infrastructure. It linked factory workers, rail engineers, and frontline soldiers in one continuous supply chain. And as the Allies prepared for their largest offensives in Europe, the quiet genius of rural innovation, born in barns and mills, was about to meet the crucible of war itself. In the annals of World War II, the battles we remember, Stalingrad, Normandy, Midway, were decided by courage and steel. But beneath those headlines, an unseen struggle unfolded. The battle to keep men fed, marching, and functional. Behind every victory photograph stood a line of supply that began not with generals, but with farmers. The human story of the corn-flour revolution begins far from the front. By 1942, rural America had been hollowed out by enlistment. Sons were gone, leaving fathers, mothers, and daughters to shoulder the burden of feeding an army. Yet the hardship bred creativity. Farmers faced government quotas and fuel shortages, but found ways to stretch every resource. Some mixed ground corn with leftover barley or rye, creating high-yield hybrids that required less milling energy. Others rebuilt broken mechanical parts using scrap metal and tractor belts, keeping the mills alive when factories prioritized weapons. Their work carried an emotional weight. They might never see the men who ate their food, but they understood their importance. In small towns, church bulletins listed the names of local soldiers, and beside each name, a note read, "Fed by us." That quiet pride was the moral backbone of the supply chain. In laboratories across Illinois and Minnesota, scientists treated food like ammunition. Their challenge: make each calorie travel farther and last longer. Cornstarch proved ideal. When processed into dextrin, it acted as a natural preservative, reducing moisture absorption. Its glucose chains stabilized protein structures, preventing spoilage. Dr. Frederick C. Blodgett, an agricultural chemist in Peoria, once wrote, "Corn is not simply a food, it is a structure of energy." His team developed powdered formulations that could be rehydrated instantly with hot water, producing stews or gravies in seconds, critical for frontline units operating without field kitchens. These discoveries went hand in hand with wartime engineering. Newly developed packaging materials like cellophane and early polyethylene derived from corn ethanol created an invisible barrier against humidity and pests. What had once been a farmer's crop now intersected with chemistry, logistics, and material science in a seamless chain of wartime innovation. While aircraft plants in California and shipyards in Virginia drew the spotlight, the Midwest became the quiet industrial juggernaut of sustenance. Railways stitched together a continent-wide system of food delivery. Grain elevators operated like arsenals, with round-the-clock shifts loading sacks marked U.S. Army property. Mills in St. Louis, Omaha, and Des Moines expanded capacity by up to 300%. Steam locomotives carried shipments eastward under blackout regulations, their windows painted dark to avoid becoming targets for saboteurs. Inside the cars were not bombs or shells, but the lifeblood of the Allied forces, corn converted into flour, syrup, oil, and alcohol. Industrial alcohol from corn even powered the synthetic rubber program and explosives manufacturing, linking the humble crop to weapons of war. Ethanol was distilled not just for food, but for propellant stabilization and antiseptics. The line between feeding and fighting blurred completely. It was here that the genius of integration appeared. Civilian industry and agricultural output were synchronized as never before. Every stage of production, planting, grinding, packaging, shipping, was tracked through meticulous government coordination. A ton of corn could be traced from a Kansas field to a Normandy mess tent, its journey documented like a rifle's serial number. The result was efficiency on a scale no enemy could match. German forces relied on fragmented supply chains. Italian troops often suffered from malnutrition. Japanese convoys starved in isolation. The Allies, by contrast, could count on consistency, each meal predictable, caloric, and safe. And yet, beyond the data and tonnage, there lingered a deeper truth. This success was powered by people who believed that simple work mattered. A farmer tightening a mill belt, a chemist pouring a flask of starch, a machinist stamping U.S. Army onto a burlap sack, all shared a single unspoken mission: keep the men alive long enough to end the war. From these efforts would emerge new frontiers, economic, moral, and psychological, showing that food was not just sustenance, but strategy, memory, and meaning. Those angles would soon reveal how a taste of home became a weapon of endurance. Corn's victory was also an economic triumph. In wartime accounting, every calorie mattered. Wheat had to be imported or transported over long distances, while corn could be sourced domestically in massive quantities. By 1943, over 80% of the nation's corn harvest was redirected into the war effort, not only for food, but also for industrial conversion. Each ton of corn flour cost a fraction of what imported grain did, yet delivered nearly equal energy. It required less water to process, consumed less fuel to dry, and packed more nutritional density per cubic foot. When multiplied across millions of rations, this efficiency freed the Allied budget for munitions, vehicles, and research. The War Production Board's reports from 1944 show that logistical savings from corn-based substitutions equated to the cost of producing roughly 3,000 Sherman tanks. It was a staggering calculation that the smallest ingredient could have armored consequences. Moreover, this shift stabilized rural economies. Farmers who once faced bankruptcy during the Great Depression now found guaranteed buyers. The wartime demand rejuvenated rural infrastructure. New silos, mills, and railway lines turned isolated farming communities into logistical hubs. This decentralization made the entire food network harder to disrupt. In short, the war fed on corn, and corn fed America's revival. But numbers alone cannot explain why this innovation mattered. Soldiers wrote about it. They tasted it. Corn had a memory. Its flavor linked the front lines to the heartland. In foxholes and jungle camps, that faint sweetness in biscuits or thickened gravy reminded men of home. It wasn't luxury, it was identity. Letters sent from Normandy, Anzio, and Saipan often mention corn mush or corn cakes. For men from Kansas, Alabama, or Tennessee, it was more than food. It was connection. Military psychologists understood this instinctively. A ration that evoked familiarity boosted morale more effectively than caffeine or sugar. Soldiers trusted the food that reminded them of their mother's kitchens. Even in exhaustion, that recognition triggered calm and endurance. The War Department quietly funded studies correlating diet with combat effectiveness, finding that morale improved measurably when soldiers consumed meals resembling domestic comfort foods. Corn, in that sense, became emotional ammunition. Its presence in rations turned each meal into a miniature act of reassurance. You're still part of home. You're still part of something worth fighting for. Across the front lines, Axis forces faced the opposite reality. Germany's logistics collapsed under the weight of scarcity. Wheat supplies from occupied territories dwindled as transport lines were bombed. Substitute flours made from potatoes, acorns, and even sawdust appeared in desperate attempts to stretch rations. Soldiers grew weaker. Diseases spread. Japanese troops in the Pacific suffered catastrophic shortages. Their diets, heavily dependent on rice, lacked protein and vitamins during prolonged campaigns. Without access to diversified food sources, their endurance withered. Accounts from Allied prisoners of war describe Japanese soldiers so malnourished that their discipline deteriorated. The contrast was stark. While Axis soldiers starved, American forces advanced on full stomachs. Each can of cornbread mix or powdered stew represented not only sustenance, but strategic supremacy. Logistics officers at Supreme Headquarters, Allied Expeditionary Force, SHE-EF, noted that the American soldier marched on an unbroken chain of calories. This was not chance. It was deliberate. The U.S. command had recognized what earlier armies had not, that morale and metabolism were twin engines of war. The science of food was the science of endurance, and at the root of it all was a crop that could be grown, milled, and moved with astonishing speed. Corn unified the rural and the industrial, the civilian and the military, the emotional and the mechanical. It was the quiet victory before the battlefield, one that would soon manifest in the largest invasion in human history, where every ounce of supply precision meant the difference between triumph and collapse. From the taste of home to the weight of victory, the story of corn now converged with the war's defining moment. When the logistical theories of America's heartland were tested on the cozy, blood-soaked beaches of Normandy. June 1944. The English Channel was thick with fog and steel. Operation Overlord, the Allied invasion of Normandy, was about to unfold, and every soldier, ship, and ration had to move in perfect synchrony. Beneath the headlines of bravery and strategy lay a quieter miracle, the invisible orchestration of food logistics that made the invasion physically possible. In the months leading to D-Day, Allied planners in London had faced an unsolvable equation: how to sustain millions of men across a storm-torn ocean, onto a hostile coast, and into enemy territory without a reliable supply base. The answer began in warehouses in Liverpool, Southampton, and Bristol, stacked with crates labeled C rations and K rations. Inside them lay compressed energy, biscuits, soups, gravies, and powders, stabilized by one humble ingredient: corn. Each ration box was a triumph of chemistry and efficiency. Wheat bread would have spoiled in a week. Corn flour survived months of damp maritime air. Its low moisture content meant less weight, less mold, and more calories per cubic foot of cargo. In logistical terms, it was as revolutionary as radar. For every soldier who landed on Omaha Beach, roughly 3 pounds of food per day had to be available, nearly 12,000 tons daily, across all invasion forces. Ships carrying ammunition shared deck space with food containers. Supply officers calculated everything down to the calorie, 3,600 per man per day, balanced for protein and carbohydrate endurance. Corn flour, ground into fine meal and sealed in nitrogen-lined tins, formed the backbone of these rations. It thickened gravies, bound chocolate bars, and stabilized powdered eggs. During the first 48 hours after the landings, chaos reigned. Many supply lines broke under enemy fire. Beach depots flooded. Parachute drops scattered. Yet, amid the confusion, the soldiers never starved. Even when ammunition ran low and medics ran out of morphine, The field kitchens kept operating, small portable stoves burning under tarps, men crouched in foxholes, heating tins of corned stew and corn biscuits. War correspondents noted how the meals, though simple, lifted spirits. "You could taste America," one soldier said, biting into a ration biscuit near Carrington. That familiarity was not sentimentality, it was endurance. Physiologically, soldiers who ate predictable, high-calorie rations maintained energy levels longer and resisted infection better. The corn base gave the food slow-release glucose, sustaining focus through 20-hour combat stretches. Behind the beaches, the logistics operation was a ballet of movement. Train lines in England, coded Red Ball Express, ferried fresh supplies from ports to front lines. By July, more than 6,000 trucks ran day and night, delivering over 400,000 tons of rations and materials per month. Corn flour shipments were prioritized, their containers marked Food Class 1. Engineers built portable bakeries that used corn-wheat blends to bake millions of loaves weekly for advancing divisions. The enemy, by contrast, was collapsing under hunger. German supply convoys bombed by Allied aircraft could not replace their dwindling stores. Wehrmacht soldiers resorted to scavenging, even raiding civilian pantries. Malnutrition slowed their reaction times, weakened their morale, and reduced their capacity for prolonged defense. In stark contrast, American troops ate regularly. Even in bomb-shattered villages, soldiers mixed cornmeal with local water, cooking improvised pancakes on helmet lids. It was an image both absurd and profound. The world's most mechanized army fueled by the world's simplest grain. As General Eisenhower later wrote in his post-war memoirs, "Victory is the child of preparation." That preparation was not only tactical, but nutritional. The Quartermaster General's office calculated that by D-Day's end, corn-based foods had saved over 15% in cargo volume compared to earlier operations. Enough space to ship an additional division's worth of fuel and munitions. Logistics had become a weapon, and corn was its quiet blade. By August 1944, as Allied lines pushed through France, entire mobile depots followed the troops, cooking, packaging, and delivering food in real time. Soldiers nicknamed one of these mobile kitchens the Yellow Train, in homage to the corn flour that thickened everything they ate. And yet, few of them knew that the very grain giving them strength came from farms thousands of miles away, from Kansas, Iowa, Nebraska, places whose names were stenciled faintly on sacks, now buried in the mud of Normandy. The invasion had proven something profound, that the endurance of an army could be engineered not just through steel or strategy, but through sustenance. Corn had crossed oceans and bridged the gap between home and front. But the real test of its contribution, the long, grinding push across Europe, was only beginning. The battle would stretch through winter, through mud, through hunger and exhaustion. And once again, the quiet genius of America's food war would determine who reached Berlin first. As the Allies advanced beyond Normandy, victory was no longer a single battle. It was a continuous act of endurance. From the beaches to the hedgerows, through rain-soaked fields and ruined towns, the Army's true measure of power was not only in its guns, but in its ability to stay fed and moving. By autumn 1944, the logistics lines stretched over 700 miles from the Normandy ports to the front lines approaching Germany. Every step forward required an unbroken thread of supply. Trucks, trains, depots, and kitchens. Fuel and food shared equal importance. When fuel convoys stalled under Luftwaffe attacks, ration convoys took their place. Without the corn-based food network that underpinned the rations, those lines would have snapped. The Allied Red Ball Express became legend. Staffed largely by African-American drivers, it ran night and day, often under enemy fire, carrying everything from artillery shells to crates of food stamped Corn Derivative Ration, U.S. Army. The drivers joked that their trucks smelled like Kansas. To them, that was pride, the scent of the land that fed the fight. Each ration shipment was a link in an invisible chain of coordination. Field depots converted bulk corn flour into thousands of daily meals. Mobile bakeries baked loaves using hybrid blends developed by food scientists months earlier. Some divisions in the Third Army received fresh cornbread within 48 hours of liberation of French towns, an almost impossible logistical feat. General George S. Patton, obsessed with mobility, once remarked, "My men can eat their belts if they have to, but they can't fight on an empty stomach." His staff knew the truth. The Army's speed depended on calories per convoy. Each truckload of corn-based rations sustained a regiment for a day and kept tanks rolling eastward toward the Rhine. As winter closed in, the Battle of the Bulge tested everything the supply chain had achieved. Temperatures dropped below freezing. Snow buried supply routes. German forces struck deep into Allied lines, severing communications. For 2 weeks, surrounded American units fought in isolation, cut off from reinforcements. Yet, miraculously, starvation never set in. In Bastogne, where the 101st Airborne Division was encircled, C-47 aircraft dropped supply canisters packed with emergency rations, most of them containing corn biscuits, cornmeal, and powdered stews. The lightweight composition of corn-based food allowed each plane to carry more meals per flight. This difference, invisible on paper, translated into survival for thousands. After the siege, medics noted that soldiers who endured on these emergency rations maintained body strength better than expected. The combination of carbohydrates, oils, and starch from corn produced long-lasting energy under starvation conditions. Physiologists later credited this nutrient balance as a factor in preventing collapse among trapped units. Meanwhile, on the Eastern Front, German forces struggled to sustain their counteroffensive. Supply lines shattered. Fuel froze in trucks. Soldiers foraged or starved. In stark contrast, American logistics adapted. Heated depots stored powdered rations. Insulated containers made from corn-derived plastics preserved stocks. Each innovation had roots not in military labs, but in agricultural research stations back home. The contrast grew wider with every mile. As Allied divisions crossed the Rhine in March 1945, they did so not only on the strength of superior firepower, but on the reliability of their supply. The simple consistency of food, hot, predictable, nutritious, became a weapon of morale. Letters home spoke of corn pancakes with canned syrup, eaten beside smoldering German vehicles. Soldiers joked that corn won the war before we did. The logistical data supports that claim. Between June 1944 and May 1945, the Allied forces consumed over 4 million tons of food, with an estimated 1/3 containing corn derivatives. Loss rates to spoilage were under 2%, the lowest in modern military history. No other army in the conflict could claim such efficiency. But beyond the numbers, there was symbolism. Corn was America's crop, born of its soil, shaped by its weather, sustained by its people. Each kernel carried a piece of home across an ocean. In that sense, every meal eaten under artillery fire was an act of collective endurance, a farmer's faith transformed into a soldier's strength. When Germany finally collapsed in May 1945, the guns fell silent, but the supply lines kept moving. This time carrying food not for soldiers, but for civilians in ruined cities. The same corn shipments that once fueled invasion now fed the hungry of Europe. The weapon of sustenance became an instrument of mercy. In that quiet shift from conquest to compassion lay the final proof of what America's agricultural genius had achieved. A farmer's grain, transformed by science and logistics, had not only fed armies, but also shaped the peace to come. The war had proven a truth too simple to forget. Empires rise and fall on full stomachs. And history's greatest victory was, in part, measured in sacks of yellow grain. When the war ended in May 1945, the world's attention shifted from battlefields to survival. Entire continents lay in ruins. Cities had no infrastructure, farms no seed, and populations no food reserves. For the Allied powers, feeding liberated Europe was now as urgent as defeating the Axis had been months earlier. The American logistical miracle, perfected through years of wartime discipline, suddenly became the lifeline of the post-war world. In the first 6 months after victory, more than 25 million tons of food were shipped from the United States to Europe and Asia. Much of it was corn-based: meal, flour, syrup, and animal feed. The same technology that had sustained soldiers was repurposed for humanitarian relief. Warehouses once filled with rations now held sacks labeled UNRWA, United Nations Relief and Rehabilitation Administration. The quiet hum of Kansas mills continued without pause. The war had ended, but the work had not. The U.S. Army Quartermaster Corps coordinated shipments to Germany, France, Belgium, and Poland. Railway depots that once carried ammunition now moved food. Corn, with its low spoilage rate and easy preparation, became the core ingredient in emergency meals distributed to displaced civilians. For many in war-torn villages, their first taste of sustenance after liberation came from American corn porridge. In cities like Cologne and Rotterdam, field kitchens served thousands daily. Simple dishes of cornmeal, sugar, and milk powder that symbolized renewal. Domestically, the war's agricultural mobilization had permanently changed American farming. Mechanization had accelerated. Tractors and combines replaced horses and hand tools. Rural electrification, begun under the New Deal, now became essential infrastructure. Farmers who once struggled through the Depression emerged as global suppliers. Exports of corn and corn byproducts quadrupled between 1945 and 1950, transforming the crop from a national staple into a global commodity. Government agencies recognized this shift. The newly reorganized Department of Agriculture established permanent research centers focusing on food science, preservation, and logistics, fields born directly from wartime necessity. The National Corn Research Council was formed in 1946, linking scientists and industrialists to explore new peacetime applications: plastics, fuel alcohol, and pharmaceuticals. The war had proven corn's versatility. Peace would turn that versatility into prosperity. On the policy front, the lessons of wartime rationing shaped future economic planning. The Marshall Plan, 1948-1952, officially known as the European Recovery Program, carried forward the same logistical blueprint that had powered Allied rations. American grain, especially corn, became both economic aid and diplomatic leverage. Ships that once delivered troops now delivered trade. European nations rebuilt not only their cities, but also their diets under the quiet guidance of U.S. agricultural influence. Yet beneath the statistics lay a deeper transformation. The moral idea that food could be as strategic as firepower had taken root. War planners, economists, and generals alike now understood that nutrition was a dimension of national security. In the early years of the Cold War, American policymakers referred to this as the corn front line, a symbolic phrase describing the global reach of American agriculture as a stabilizing force. For millions of returning veterans, the connection was personal. Many came home to the same fields that had fed them abroad. They saw, often for the first time, the power of their own communities. County fairs honored local farmers for wartime production heroism. A new generation of agricultural education programs, supported by the G.I. Bill, spread modern techniques across the heartland. The relationship between soldier and farmer, forged in necessity, became the foundation of rural identity for decades to come. By 1946, America had not only fed its allies and enemies alike, it had proven that the science of sustenance could win both war and peace. But the larger transformation was still unfolding, the rise of a new industrial food empire that would change the planet itself. By the late 1940s, the American wartime food machine had evolved into something larger, a global system. Corn, once a regional crop known mainly to Midwestern farmers, became the blueprint for industrial agriculture. The lessons of the battlefield were now applied to the marketplace, and the infrastructure that had once sustained soldiers began feeding entire nations. The war had proven the efficiency of centralized coordination between government, science, and industry. Private corporations that had produced wartime rations now redirected their capabilities toward civilian food manufacturing. Cargill, General Mills, and Archer Daniels Midland expanded rapidly, building massive mills and processing plants. Corn syrup replaced sugar in soft drinks, corn oil replaced animal fat, and the industrial fermentation techniques developed for wartime alcohol production were converted into biochemical innovation. It was the dawn of agribusiness, and at Apoitiki, its core was the same principle that had driven victory: stability through efficiency. The humble grain that had traveled from Kansas to Normandy now fueled an economy. Every part of the kernel found a use: starch for paper, oil for cooking, glucose for energy, ethanol for engines. The smart trick with corn flour, born in a dusty farm shed, had become a philosophy of production. As Europe rebuilt, American grain became a tool of diplomacy. Under the Marshall Plan, corn shipments acted as both humanitarian aid and strategic influence. Nations that adopted American agricultural methods, hybrid seeds, fertilizer, mechanized harvesters, were rewarded with steady supplies and economic support. The United States understood that food could command loyalty where armies could not. Even in Asia, under the post-war occupation of Japan, American cornmeal and soy flour were distributed to rebuild nutrition levels among civilians and children. These programs laid the groundwork for the global spread of Western agricultural models. By the early 1950s, the corn economy had become a symbol of progress: high yield, industrialized, and standardized. The scientific breakthroughs of the 1940s became the foundation for modern food technology. The corn-based stabilizers, emulsifiers, and packaging materials that had once kept rations fresh in the tropics evolved into commercial innovations. Corn derivatives appeared in everything, from instant soup to pharmaceuticals. The Peoria laboratory that had once tested field rations went on to pioneer the mass production of penicillin using corn steep liquor, a byproduct of milling. Thus, the same crop that fed armies also helped fuel a medical revolution. By the mid-20th century, the agricultural laboratories of the Midwest were as vital as any weapons lab. Food scientists began referring to their field as strategic biochemistry, and the wartime partnerships between universities and government agencies persisted into peacetime. Nutrition science, logistics, and industrial chemistry became permanent fixtures of American research policy. Yet the transformation carried paradoxes. The abundance that fed the world also began to reshape its values. The efficiency of mass production distanced people from the land that had sustained them. Cornfields became symbols of both prosperity and overreach, of a civilization that could manufacture calories faster than it could understand their cost. Still, for those who lived through the war, corn remained a symbol of something simpler and truer: the unity between effort and purpose. Veterans visiting Europe decades later often found that the children they had once fed during the relief years still remembered the yellow American meal that had kept them alive. The memory of food, like the memory of liberation, never faded. By the 1950s, Corn exports had surpassed pre-war levels tenfold. What had started as a farmer's innovation to prevent waste had transformed global trade, nutrition, and politics. It proved that wars are not won solely by strategy or strength, but by sustenance, by the unseen science of feeding endurance. The United States entered the post-war era as not only a military superpower, but also a nutritional one. Its dominance in agriculture, logistics, and food science defined modern civilization as much as its nuclear arsenal. And somewhere in the middle of it all, the echo of that millstone in Kansas, turning slowly, steadily, still resonated. It was the sound of innovation, resilience, and the quiet truth that the smallest ideas can nourish the largest victories. In every great war, there are inventions that dazzle history. Tanks, planes, codes, and bombs. But just beneath them lies a quieter legacy, the unseen ingenuity that sustains them all. The story of corn in World War II is one of those quiet revolutions, born not in laboratories or command centers, but in the patient rhythm of rural life. The farmer in Kansas who ground his grain did not know he was shaping strategy. The chemist who stabilized flour did not imagine he was designing victory. Yet, together, they revealed a timeless truth. Endurance wins wars, not spectacle. What defeated fascism was not only courage and firepower, it was the ability to keep millions of men nourished, coordinated, and moving toward a single purpose. The humble corn kernel became a symbol of that unity. It embodied American adaptability, the transformation of scarcity into abundance, simplicity into strength. When soldiers bit into a ration biscuit on a frozen front, or tasted corn gravy under shell fire, they were, in a sense, consuming the ingenuity of their homeland. That legacy did not end with victory. It shaped how humanity learned to feed itself, through science, cooperation, and imagination. From post-war recovery to modern food systems, the echoes of that wartime invention still guide how we think about sustenance and survival. Corn taught the world that innovation is not always explosive. Sometimes it's a quiet wheel turning in a wooden mill, unseen and uncelebrated, yet powerful enough to sustain empires. And long after the rifles rusted and the battlefields grew silent, that sound, the steady grind of corn into flour, remained a reminder of what truly won the war: the resourcefulness of ordinary people who refused to let hunger or hardship define them. A grain became a weapon became a meal, and a meal became history.